All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back for week 7. Moving right along. How's everything doing? Everything doing okay for you? Hopefully, um, life is treating you well. The semester's treating you well. Let's get into what we have to talk about. In terms of just some housekeeping, y'all, thank you for your patience in grading. I've kind of gotten a little bit behind with other deadlines and then the deadlines of this class and everything that it entails. We will, Amanda and I will, get your grading back as soon as we can. Thanks for your patience. I've never been the fastest grader. That's just kind of the way it works for me. But I will do my level best to get caught up as soon as I can. And that includes giving you the review sheets for the upcoming quiz. And when I say upcoming, you have a few weeks yet. It's October 21st. But you will have those in time to study off of them. Because again, it's going to be just like the first one in terms of the types of questions and also just the fact that they're coming straight off of the review sheet. So, yeah, so we have that. Just a reminder, the first paper, the church visit paper, is due October 14th. I know I've been harping on it. But let me just throw this out there again. If you have questions, if you run into difficulties, if you're not sure which direction to take when you're writing this thing, I am open to help you as best I can. I'm not going to tell you how to write it per se, but I'm going to tell you, hey, this is what I would do if you ask. And if your professor gives you advice along the lines of, this is what I would do, that's probably, they're going to grade it in accordance with that. So that might be a good piece of information to have. And I'm just telling you that I'm willing to make that piece of information available to you if you want it. So if that's the case, like I said, you know how to reach me, get in contact. I'm sorry about this. I just needed a little extra help today. There we go. Hope that mug's big enough. Yeah, so I think those are the big things. Other than that, we're kind of in that rhythm now. I hope one of the difficulties of online is I can't look at you. I can ask you, through the computer screen how you're doing, but I can't see you, which is kind of frustrating in a way. But I do hope that it's going well. I hope the class is going well. I hope these lectures are helpful. Yeah, let me know. Seek me out if I can be more help to you than I already have been or haven't been, and that goes for Amanda as well. So anyway, how do you like Dreyer? You like it? It's different. I know that. But I wanted to talk about theology, and I wanted to talk about it in a way that was accessible. And the way that Dreyer tells his story, which is connected to Dante's story, which is a theological poem, allows him a lot of opportunities to bring up some pretty meaty theological stuff. And if we want to learn about this religion, learn about how this religion's put together, learning these meaty theological things is a good way to start understanding how it's constructed in terms of theology, in terms of belief system. It gives us a chance. So really what I wanted to do today was continue to walk through. I think I gave you chapters 9 through 16 today. I just wanted to keep walking through it and stop at some points along the way and just kind of pause and say, hey, pay attention to this because this is really interesting theological stuff, and see what comes of it. So with that in mind, chapter 9. Now remember, we're in the Inferno. So in the story of Dante that Dreyer is reading and basing his book off of, Dante is in the Inferno. I don't know if touring is the right word, but he's visiting the Inferno. Virgil, the poet Virgil, is his guide, the person who's leading him through it. And he's visiting, again, it sounds touristy, doesn't it? Like, oh, he's visiting hell. But he's being shown, maybe that's a better way to put it, he's being shown the Inferno, and he's being shown the people who reside there, the damned who reside forever in the Inferno. And he's being shown that the way in which they're being punished, remember we talked about it, the way in which they're being punished is a reflection of the choices that they made while they walked on the earth as living human beings. It's not arbitrary. It's not, it's not something as basic as a lot of fun, like for example, a lot of fundamentalist Christian theology talks. There's verses in Revelation that refer to a lake of fire. Some fundamentalist strains of Christianity take that literally, like you will be thrown literally into a lake of fire at the end. This is a little bit more nuanced than that. I mean, there is a sense of punishment and a sense of physical punishment involved, which is controversial. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's a little bit more nuanced, and that Dante is really at pains to show that what you do, there's continuity between the life you live on earth and your fate and your experience in the afterlife. And what you do on earth shapes you into the person. It shapes you, and it shapes the afterlife that has been constructed for you. And in the case of the Inferno, that ain't good. Because you're talking about damnation, you're talking about punishment, which, so there you go. So we talked about lust, and he talked about the people who gave into lust while they were on earth, while they were forever in this tempest, forever in this squall, and it's a symbolic of the fact that they gave themselves over to these tidal waves, these hurricanes of passion, if you will, and then in the afterlife they get stuck in a hurricane. You gave yourself over to this, here are the consequences of that. Talked about money, similar thing. And now, the chapters that we're going over, which will take us to the end of the Inferno section of the book, you start to get into a little bit more esoteric sins. You start to get a little bit more stuff that maybe is not as intuitive. I mean, anyone with any knowledge of Christianity at all can look at lust and look at greed and go, well, yeah, that's part of the 7 deadly sins, and that makes sense. But he would talk about that. But when you get into the stuff that we're talking about today, and you start talking about, like the love of knowledge, the love of family, the love of place, how in the world can that be sinful? Well, we talked about this last week as well, this whole idea of disordered loves. And how that produces idols, and how that wreaks havoc. And that's kind of what this section deals with. So just walking through it. Chapter 9, he starts talking about knowledge as an idol. He starts talking about books, book therapy, which, I don't know, it's something, he is a bookish nerd. And as someone who also self-identifies as a bookish nerd, this section kind of rang my bell a little bit, because I've done book therapy before. Have you? And by book therapy, what he means is, looking for answers, looking for ways in which to live a better life in the pages of books. It's not entirely uncommon. It's got a pretty long history in Christianity, actually. And there's controversy and there's discussions, and I don't want to drag you too much into these discussions. But there's a thing called biblicism, which I'm thinking of Christian Smith in particular, some scholars have accused, again, more conservative strains of Christianity, as engaging in biblicism. And what's that? Well, it's worshiping the book and not the God that's referred to in the book. It's holding the Bible up not just as the revelation of God, but as a very form of God himself. In Christianity, Christians have long referred to themselves as people of the book. It's been a title of the church for a very long time. So this has particular relevance for that. But even beyond that, I think it's something that has relevance for anyone who puts a high price on knowledge. And seeing as you're all University of Florida students, I'm a University of Florida student, I think that's just about all of us. I think we all qualify on some level for that. Where our first move, and again, this doesn't apply to everyone equally. I imagine there's probably some, and again, I would self-identify here, where the first move is, if I can cognitively understand something, then I got it and I can do it. Like, if I want to, if I need to, if I need to figure out how to succeed in relationships, well, all right, give me a self-help book. If I need to figure out how to develop a yoga program, okay, cool, give me a book or something I can read so I can understand what yoga is, and then I can do it. Weird examples, but you get the idea, where it's like, where are the answers to be found? Where is success to be found? Well, it's in, as long as I got it up here, I don't have to worry about everything else. But the point that Dreyer wants to make is that this too is disordered love. How is it disordered love? Well, basically, you are putting too much stock putting too much faith in your cognitive capacity to figure things out, and putting too much faith in the cognitive mind and reason. Um, this is the story of the modern age. This is the story of the Enlightenment. You're putting too much faith in reason to figure things out. How does that translate? Or, how does that, or maybe a better way to say it, why does that not work? Because there are elements of life, and, Dreher's going to argue, there are elements of Christianity that can't be captured by reason. There are elements of life that are more in the realm of emotion. There are more elements of life that are more in the realm of practice. There are more elements of life that extend beyond. Success does not necessarily mean I have cognitive understanding of it. It would be like someone saying, I can be in the major leagues and hit a fastball because I've read books on physics, I've read books on baseball, I know the sport inside and out, and I know exactly how to do this. If I still go up to the plate and try to hit a fastball, it's not going to happen. There are things that extend beyond our cognitive ability to understand them. And Dreher wants to say Christianity is one of them. And how does this play itself out? It plays itself out a lot of times, honestly, in discussions about theology and discussions about God. You might have seen this before, where Christians who, the scriptures say are to be known for their love and to be known for the way in which they treat people, end up treating people horribly on the basis of a theological proposition. I have the theology right, you don't, therefore I can treat you in a way that is, and it doesn't really matter how I treat you. The point that Dreher wants to make, and ultimately the point that Dante is making, is that that's not what this is. That's not how Christianity works. That's not the key to success. You can have all of the right answers, but still be mean. And we've seen this play out in the common square, I think, in some ways. But what the bottom line is, it's more than just a set of cognitive beliefs. It gets tricky sometimes because when you go to talk to a Christian, or if you study Christianity, a lot of times the discussion will revolve around what a Christian believes. Like even just a discussion of theology is primarily what a Christian believes, and that's okay. And you can say, I believe, like the creeds, for example, I believe in God the Father. What does that mean? You have a cognitive understanding of God the Father? How does that work? More importantly, how does that play out in regular life? Christianity is a set of beliefs, if you will. It is, there are very distinctive things that you must grant cognitive assent to in order to be considered Christian, but it's certainly not limited to that. It's certainly not all that it is. There is practice involved. There are emotions involved. There are all these other elements that you can't get in a book. So it was very interesting that our starting point here, chapter 9, is this idea of knowledge as an idol, cognitive knowledge as the end all, and Dante wants to say, and ultimately Dreher wants to say, nope, that's not it. So how do you deal with this intellectualism? How do you deal with this belief that as long as I understand it intellectually, I got it? The prescription that Dreher receives at the hands of his priest, Father Matthew, we meet Father Matthew in this chapter, is basically ritual. He gets rituals that are designed not that he will understand them per se, but so that his person will be changed in the process of performing the ritual. There's a lot. You could talk about ritual to death. I mean, there's so much you could say, but probably in the sake of time, I just want to focus on the ones that Dreher himself focuses on in this chapter, which are confession and prayer. Father Matthew tells Dreher, look at the church as the hospital. What does that mean? Well, there's an expectation of healing, there's an expectation of change, and you can't just will that into being with your head. There are other things happening. So there's the discipline of confession, where Dreher goes to Father Matthew and confesses his sins. For a lot of non-Christians, even for a lot of Protestants, this sounds weird. It is a fundamentally Catholic, or in Dreher's case, Orthodox practice. but something that the Protestant Church, there are exceptions obviously, but something that the Protestant Church by and large doesn't practice as much. Um, there are complicated reasons as to why that is, views of the priesthood and whatnot. But one of the rituals, one of the ways in which Dreyer says, I changed in this process, was in the confessional booth. Going to the confessional booth and looking at Father Matthew and saying, all right, here's how I screwed up. And it's probably, I gotta tell you, just for me personally, it doesn't sound like it doesn't sound like something that sounds like fun, let's go do that. But what Dreyer is describing in this process of confession is a process of personal change. And you're going to find, as you continue to read this book, if you haven't already noticed, a lot of his breakthroughs are connected with this process of, okay, here's where I got it wrong. Here's where I'm holding on to anger. Here's where I'm pursuing idols. Here's where I'm sinning. And I need a physical representation of God's forgiveness. And that's what confession is. And that's what the priest represents. In the priest's forgiveness, it's not just, I was forgiven by Father Matthew. Okay, fine. But it's also a physical manifestation. It's a physical symbolic action symbolizing God's forgiveness on the Christian, on the sinner. So that carries a lot more weight, and there's a lot more power there. So confession is one, prayer is the other. And again, this is a very different form of prayer, especially if you didn't grow up Catholic or if you don't have an Orthodox background. This might be a different type of prayer, because this isn't the type of prayer where it's extemporaneous. I'm kind of thinking about it in terms of conversation, of a monologue, a dialogue, or maybe more realistically, a monologue. Something that I say to God about my day and about the stuff that happens in my day, and please help me out with the stuff that happens in my day. This is prayer in terms of, I don't want to say mindless, because I'm not sure that's the right word, but this is prayer that's very ritualistic, based on a mantra, and has a physical component, the prayer beads. He is charged to say the Jesus prayer a lot. And that is the discipline that he is given. According to the text, Father Matthew wants him to pursue this discipline for the rest of his life. This kind of repetitive, repeating the mantra over and over and over. And it's really interesting. I didn't quote it, but you can go back and read it. The process of Dreyer getting into shape, if you will, becoming the sort of person who can do this. Because he says that the first time I tried it, my brain was all over the place. I couldn't keep focused. It was horrible. I didn't like it very much. But then he says, over time, I began to change, and I began to feel my whole, not only the mind, but just my whole person change as a result of going through this process. And I wondered while I was reading it, I was like, I wonder how, if non-Christians, if you have any contact with non-Christian, quote-unquote Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, or even just transcendental meditation, there seem to be more in common with meditation in this style of prayer than in the traditional Protestant understanding. Well, maybe not, that's not the best way to say it, but in the understanding of prayer that a lot of people have, where it's like, I'm driving and the car pulls out and it's Jesus, take the wheel. This kind of extemporaneous, oh crap, this happened. Oh God, help me with this, or God, thank you with this, or that type of thing. It's a very different style. But again, it goes back to this idea of ritual, this idea of these practices that aren't primarily designed to engage the mind. They're designed to engage other parts of the being and kind of pull the mind along with them. And confession and prayer are two examples. Honestly, I think using artwork is another one. There's one of the reasons I gave you this book is because it engages Dante. It engages a very famous piece of literature, poetry. Later, we're going to read a book of fiction. Why do I do this in a class on Christianity? Because this is another method that Christianity and Christians have used from the very beginning to engage people, where you're engaging the mind, but you're doing it through the heart, through the emotions, through these other faculties, where it's not a cognitive assent. But you look at things like the Bible, where if you have any knowledge of the Bible, the book of Romans is very different than the book of Psalms, right? One is a book of logic and linear thought and essays. The other is a book of poetry. They both ultimately talk about a lot of the same subjects, but in profoundly different ways. So interesting that the first move is this kind of a sense of you need to get out of your head a little bit. And for Dreyer's story personally, there's relevance, but also for other things as well. Father Matthew, there's a quote from Father Matthew: "The only way to help people was to heal my own heart." So it's not just a transference of information that's going on. There's more involved. And there's more involved in Christianity than just theological stuff. Okay, chapter 10 gets into the nature of this whole idea. I guess the Italian term is contrapasso, to suffer the opposite. This idea of sin having real consequences, and in this case, real disfiguring consequences. Chapter 10 just made me laugh because the flatterers, he said, and there's a picture of those who are incessant flatterers in life, they're face down in shit. Their eternal punishment is to literally be like, you are completely full of shit. That is literally their punishment in the afterlife. And again, it's a direct result of their behavior and the choices that they made while they were alive. Why do it this way? Again, it's interesting, and as a piece of artwork, it's compelling. But also, again, Dante is at pains to show that sin isn't just, and we talked about this last week, sin is not just abstract rule breaking, but that it's a real thing with real consequences. And those consequences are disfiguring. You're basically taking the human as the image of God and you're warping it, you're perverting it. How is that happening? Through the cognitive, through the effect of these sins, the cumulative effect of these sins. You become the sort of person that wouldn't choose heaven even if it was offered to you. Which again is an interesting idea. It's a little bit more of a nuanced idea of this whole process of heaven and hell and punishment and blessing than what you typically get. So anyway, chapter 10 showing how the sin that you commit in your daily life has eternal effects, if you will. Talks about this thing, the whole idea of terrible fascination. He has this quote from Augustine, who we'll hear about a lot. Quote from Augustine about someone who went to go see the gladiatorial games, who went in with a sense of, I can't watch this, this is corrupting, I can't even look at this, but finally gives into the temptation and just becomes enamored of it, becomes enthralled by it. And the whole point is, beware of, limit what your eyes can see, which is a profoundly countercultural message even nowadays. Nowadays it seems like, you don't miss out on anything, take in anything and everything, whether it's good or bad, just to have the experience of it. That is an idea that's fundamentally at odds with a lot of Christian theology. In Christian theology, there is a long tradition of the sense of being mindful of what you take in. Because what you take in, you don't just take in a vacuum with no effects. It changes you. It makes you into a different person. And that change isn't always for the good. So you see that here in chapter 10. You see that sense of you need to be mindful of what you allow yourself to experience, because he quotes Nietzsche. He says, when you look into the abyss looks right back. And it might be ironic to quote Nietzsche in a Christianity setting, but it's really capturing something here that Dreyer really wants to show. This whole notion of, beware of terrible fascination, limit what you take in, because what you take in is not going to have a neutral effect. It's going to affect you in some way. It's just a question of how that is. And it works both ways. You can be affected positively if you take in, and like someone like Augustine, for example, if you take in the things of God, it's going to affect you positively. It's going to change you positively. But if you take in things that are inherently sinful, you're going to get dragged down. So again, it's this really interesting idea of sin that shows up, and it paints a picture just of the theological nature of it as a whole, of this really it's interwoven. It's complicated. It's not just kind of, did I check the boxes of good behavior or not? I mean, a lot of times that's the caricature, and a lot of Christians, honestly, don't do anything to dispel that caricature. Like, oh, I went to church. Oh, I did this. Oh, I did this. I am doing great. I'm in a good position. God must love me. It's a lot more complicated than that. And it's one of the reasons, I mean, you talk about Christians historically have fought to limit in the public square. Well, I mean, think about something like prohibition, alcohol, or gambling, or pornography. I mean, some of these things, again, this kind of helps to explain some of the real life politics. Christians have been involved in all of these battles. And the people who stand against them, more libertarian-minded people, like you're stepping on the freedom of people to engage in these behaviors if you want to engage in them. But the Christian response is, yes, we are, but we're doing it because these things are not value neutral; they are corrosive, and they are going to have a negative impact on society as a whole. Now, that's an argument. Honestly, obviously, not all Christians share that perspective, but that is the perspective of a lot of Christians who get involved in these types of things. Crusades against gambling and whatnot. It's interesting to see here how Christian, traditional Christian theology goes up against kind of the American ideal of freedom and individualism and liberty, and I can choose to do this. Whereas over here, you have the people that are going, well, you can choose to do it, but it's harmful, and it has a cumulative harmful impact on society, then it might be in our best interest to limit your choice to do it. It's interesting because there is a bit of a clash there. Okay, chapter 11. Heresy. You're a heretic. That's a word that, again, it's one of those kind of old words that you don't hear very often. But in his understanding, heresy is simply mistaking part of the truth for the whole thing, being partly right. And what that allows is for Dreyer to get into the meat of his own story, where he's talking about his love of place, his love of family, and the fact that he only had the partial story here. And moreover, he took these things that were good and based on the whole disordered love idea that we talked about last week, made them into something that they shouldn't have been. And disordered loves turn even good things into bad things. And, again, how can you think of family and place as things that are sinful? They're not inherently sinful. They're not, but when they are taken and treated in a way, and asked to do what they were never meant to do, that is when they become sinful. So Dreyer comes to this realization. He's like, look, I've been holding up my family, and I've been holding up my home, and I've been holding up this vision of what I thought life would be as the ultimate thing, and it's not meant to be the ultimate thing. It can be changed, it can be altered, and it can even fail. And I need to be okay with that. And it's a horrendous struggle for him, and he goes to therapy because of it, and he goes to confession because of it. You're really getting into the meat of Dreyer's story here, and just the battles that he has to overcome. And it's taking things that are fundamentally good things. They're not even value-neutral things. Place and family are good things. But the fact that they're disordered in his mind turns them into idols. Remember, I think we quoted this last week. John Calvin said the human heart is an idol factory. Well, here's the thing about idols. In Christian understanding, when you take an idol and put it in the place where God is supposed to go, that idol becomes a tyrant. It will rule you. For whatever reason, I'm thinking of like Metallica, Master of Puppets here. And maybe Addiction's a crazy example, but if you've ever heard that song, it is the process of someone becoming completely ensnared by, Master of Puppets, the imagery, it's the process of someone becoming completely ensnared by religion, completely ensnared by addiction. And there comes a point in the process where this thing that was at first enjoyable, because all addictions are like this, at first it's enjoyable to the individual, otherwise they wouldn't do it. but it becomes this thing that's no longer enjoyable, but still must be done. And it exacts a horrible toll on the addict. It's not that far off from describing what Dreher is describing here. He takes these good things, he puts them on the pedestal. Since they're not meant to be up there, they act as tyrants, and they exact a horrible toll on his psyche and even his physical health, because he makes these visions try to do something that they weren't supposed to do. And the Christian understanding of this is, yes, you've put these visions in the place where God was supposed to be. Because God can take your vision of home, and he can take your vision of place, and he can turn it on its head. And Christian, you have to be okay with that. That has to be something that you can accept, and you can let go of these things. You hold them loosely because God can take them from you. Dreher has a hard time doing that. It causes him a lot of pain and struggle. And this is the story he tells. Now he's going to come out, he's writing this because he comes out of the other side, and he kind of comes to this realization. He has this epiphany of, oh goodness, I need to let my vision of family and my vision of a perfect family and a perfect place and a perfect life, I need to let all that go. I'm not going to get it exactly like I drew it up, because I don't have that kind of control over life. I can't orchestrate life to that degree, which gets into the pride issue. Okay, chapter 12. Deeper into the inferno we go. You start to see sins that are more, I don't want to say more serious, but you see deeper rings of hell, worse punishment. And there is a gradation here. There is a sense of these sins are more destructive than these over here, which again is not something that's shared across all Christian theology, especially the Protestant understanding, especially the understandings in Protestantism that are very heavy, like predestination, for example. If what we talked about this, if someone who believes in what Calvin called total depravity, which is this idea of human beings being so inherently sinful that they can't even move towards God. God has to move towards them. For someone with that kind of understanding, it doesn't make any sense to grade sins against each other. Like, oh, this one's a C sin, this one's an A sin, this one's serious, this one's not quite as bad. Not quite as destructive. For someone who believes in total depravity, it doesn't make sense to grade sins that way. But for someone in the Catholic tradition or the Orthodox tradition who doesn't have that understanding, in Dante being a Catholic and Dreher being an Orthodox, they can talk about gradations of sin, and some sin being more destructive than others, some sin being quote-unquote worse than others. So as you go deeper into the inferno, you see more serious sins. And you see this picture of hell which emerges. And the big thing, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record, but the big thing for Dante is that hell is something that is ultimately chosen. We had that C.S. Lewis quote from last week: "The doors of hell are locked on the inside." It is something that is ultimately chosen, and it is something that where you have, because of the choices, because of the actions, behaviors that you undertook in your life, you become the sort of person that hell is the only destination. That even if you were offered heaven, you wouldn't want it, because you're not the sort of person who could enjoy it. And the flip side of that, somebody like Martin Luther, for example, said, "I would rather be in hell with Jesus than in heaven without him." What does that mean? Well, it means what is your ultimate? What is the ultimate thing? Is it the place, or is it the deeper meaning behind the place? And that what Luther's trying to say with a quote like that is just saying, look, it's not about choosing paradise over hell. It's about choosing to go wherever Jesus is. And that is my first thing, and then heaven kind of happens as a byproduct of that. You could almost say that the picture of heaven and hell, especially the picture of hell here, that is kind of a byproduct of the choices that these individuals made. And as you get deeper, you come to find that the worst sins are the ones that corrupt the image of God in you the most. And so chapter 12, he's going to talk about suicide, which is horribly controversial. I'm trying to watch my words carefully here. because the idea of considering suicide as sinful behavior is distasteful to a lot of people, and a lot of Christians, by the way. Um, but traditionally, it always has been. In the Catholic Church, even just the traditional understanding of suicide was you are sinning. Why are you sinning? Because you are ultimately denying the image of God in yourself. You are snuffing it out. You are telling God, the way in which He created me, the way in which He created me to live in this world is not good enough. I can't go on. I'm going to preemptively stop it. So historically, over Christian history, suicide was viewed as sinful behavior. Again, it's a hell of an argument to make. It's an argument that I don't feel comfortable making. But just understanding the nature of the religion and understanding the theology behind it, you can kind of see where it's going. If sin warps and denies the image of God, if it shifts and fundamentally perverts the image of God, then in some ways suicide is the ultimate expression of that. Which is why it's in the deep realm of hell. So in Dreyer's telling, the way he describes this, because he acknowledges the difficulty as well, but the way in which he describes this is to say, suicide is primarily and again, this is horribly controversial and doesn't apply in all cases, but suicide is for people who can't give up the obsession of living life on their own terms. Either I have life on my own terms, or I don't have life at all. It's making them, it's kind of making yourself into a god in a really weird way. It's an expression of control, or it's an expression of frustration at the lack of control. Now again, been a lot of work done on this issue in mental health, been a lot of work done in theology on this issue. Not everyone holds this understanding. This isn't across the board a Christian understanding. It is by and large a traditional historical one. It's the one you see in Dante, and it's the one that Dreyer has to deal with here. And you can tell by the way he deals with it, he's not entirely comfortable with it. But this is the explanation that he gives. It goes back to a lot of these same themes, though. It goes back to the disfiguring nature of sin. It goes back to the choices you make on earth affecting your afterlife beyond. It goes to the root of pride. I will have my way, or I won't have any way at all. All of these things we've talked about before in terms of the nature of sin and what it is. But in some ways, this is a crystallized version of that that we see here in chapter 12. And it continues into chapter 13. And speaking of controversial things, chapter 13 is where Dreyer recounts in Dante. This is the part where Dante meets what he calls the Sodomites. Yikes. Dealing with the topic of homosexuality. Now, I'm probably going to spend time on this later in the semester when I start talking about ethics and current events issues and how that plays itself out. Here's what I want to say right now. What you're getting is, remember, what you're getting is a 14th century Christian. It's 21st century Christians' interpretation of a 14th century Christian, but at the root, what you're getting here is Dante. Dante's not a modern day liberal. He's not a modern day, he's not a modern day conservative. His lines of thought don't really line up with modern discussions and debates about the nature of homosexuality. This issue has come a long way since Dante. That goes without saying, right? But what we're giving you here now may be a way into understanding, like especially if you're one of those people that look at this issue and go, I can't understand why those conservatives feel the way they do. Aren't they supposed to just love everyone and accept everyone? What is the problem here? This maybe will shed some light into why conservative traditionalist understandings of this issue, where they might be coming from. So that's my disclaimer. Again, let me say it one more time. There are lots of Christians who look at this perspective and go, that's not right. I don't agree with that. Most of the mainline denominations, Methodism, Episcopalians, and so on and so forth. But even people who don't claim an institutional denomination, there are many people who claim the name Christian for themselves who look at this and say, no, that's hate. But on the flip side, there are Christians who look at this and say, that's the traditional understanding. That's the understanding we've always had. Both of those groups of people are there. Remember, I'm the tour guide. I'm not taking sides. I'm showing you different pictures. Okay? You can kind of sense my nervousness here. Dante wants to talk about homosexuality as violence against nature. What does that mean? That means violence against the way that human beings were designed, including the way in which human beings were designed to have sex. This line of thinking is kind of, it's a ramification, it's an implication of the natural law. What's the natural law? The natural law was the dominant way in which medieval Catholics, of which Dante was one, understood the world. Natural law was most articulated by a guy named Thomas Aquinas. You might have heard of him, doctor of the church, one of the most fundamentally influential theologians of all time, particularly in Catholic circles. Protestants don't like Aquinas as much. Protestants go more towards the Reformers or go towards Augustine if they're looking at the ancients. But when it comes to the Catholic Church, Aquinas it's basically St. Paul and then Aquinas. I mean, he's it. Why is he it? Well, he has this description of natural law, which has been hugely influential. What is it? This description of law for Aquinas breaks down into 4 categories. There's the eternal law. What's the eternal law? The eternal law is basically the mind of God. This is the mind of God. This is how things are supposed to go. This is what you're supposed to be doing in accordance with the way in which God designed you. This is the mind of God. When God had earth in mind, and when God had you and I, and the animals, and the plants, and the trees, and everything else in mind, this is what the picture looks like. That's the eternal law. So there's the eternal law. Human beings don't have access to the eternal law because we don't have access to the mind of God, because we're not God. There's a fundamental difference. So Aquinas says the eternal law, we can't know it, but we can have a sense of what it is. How do you even get close to the eternal law? Aquinas says there are 2 fundamental ways. There's the divine law, which is that part of the eternal law given through divine revelation. In other words, the scriptures. How do we know the mind of God? Well, God has told us a fair amount of what's on his mind by way of transmitting to us what we know as the Bible. So divine law is basically the scriptures, divine revelation, what God says through the Bible. That doesn't cover every circumstance. It doesn't cover gay marriage, for example. So in order to connect, to fill in some of the holes and to fill out the understanding of eternal law as best we can as frail human beings, Aquinas says there's this thing called the natural law. What's the natural law? Well, it's that part of the eternal law that wasn't given through divine revelation, but is accessible through human reason. We can figure it out. We can figure out the way in which God had in mind for all of this stuff to go. So the natural law becomes us, when I say us, I mean human beings, figuring out what things like, I'll just give a few examples, controversial examples, how gender roles play themselves out, how this discussion of homosexuality plays itself out, what is the proper end of humanity. Now you might be thinking, well, there are some verses in the Bible that talk about those issues, aren't there? Yes, there are, but they don't give a full comprehensive understanding. In this scheme, you need not just the divine revelation, but you also need the power of human reason to figure out how this works, how it plays itself out, and what the best and what the goal is for humanity. How then should we live, like Francis Schaeffer said. So then you have this last category, which is the human law. And the human law is the attempt by humanity to recreate the eternal law as closely as possible by using what you already have here, the divine law and the natural law. As you probably already noticed, this is the recipe for theocracy, really. It's the recipe for a system of rule, a system of government that's based on God, that's based on Christianity, that's based on the deity and what the deity wants. Now, Christianity is certainly not the only religion that's put a system like this into effect. I'm thinking of like Sharia law for Muslims, for example, and other systems in history. But bear in mind, Aquinas, and also Dante for that matter, they're operating in a time when the separation of church and state was not a concept that crossed anybody's mind. It was completely alien, it was completely foreign. Of course the state and the church were going to work together. What were they going to work together for? Well, they were going to work together for trying to create a society that matches the eternal law as closely as possible. You didn't have this sense of individualism. You didn't have this sense of, you know what, state political issues need to be over here and faith and religious issues need to be over here. The whole thing was together. Often, honestly, the state was put to the service of the church in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period. So, you didn't have that boundary. And you're thinking, what the hell does all this have to do with homosexuality? For Dante, natural law dictates that sex is something that is undertaken between a man and a woman. And that homosexuality kind of defies nature. And this argument's still around. I remember, Pastor Rick Warren, the megachurch pastor at Saddleback Church, in defending traditional marriage, made the argument. I don't remember exactly how I phrased it, but he said something. He was on Larry King, and he said something along the lines of, "Well, the plumbing works the way the plumbing's supposed to work," making an argument based on biology. I won't get too graphic for you, but the male has parts that work in conjunction with the female. Is that blatant enough? So this argument's still around. And it stems from this natural law understanding of, this is nature. This is the way it's supposed to work. Now, again, let me say one more time. There are many ways of critiquing this, and there have been many critiques of this, and natural law is not the dominant position in society anymore. But it was at the time of Dante, and you can see the effects of it in Dreyer here. So that's the reason I spend so much time to belabor this point, because I want to make sure you understand where this chapter is coming from. Because if you read chapter 13 on its face, where he talks about homosexuality as a sin in which people were consigned to hell, you might be thinking, this is awful. And you certainly wouldn't be alone in that. So my goal here is to try to explain where on earth could this possibly even be coming from. But anyway, how does Dreyer handle it? Honestly, Dreyer skirts this issue a little bit. He's clearly as uncomfortable with it as I am. He starts to spin it off into metaphor, where he starts talking about achievement. And he says, you know what? When you try to produce, when you try to do art and do stuff with an end towards making your name famous, or with an end towards, material reimbursement, ultimately that is sterile work. And the only work that is fertile, ultimately the only work that is worth doing, is work that's going to try to last beyond you. Work that serves others, serves the common good, work that stands the test of time. That is the work that, for lack of a better word, is fertile. Whereas work that is only self-serving is work that is sterile. I leave you to page 143 is where this connection gets most explicitly made. But it's, the idea here again, you have chosen, because he shows Dante in the conversation that Dante has with this individual, you have chosen to make a name for yourself in the world. You've chosen to serve yourself with your talents. You didn't serve others. You didn't serve common good. You certainly didn't serve God. So ultimately, it comes to nothing. And you're forgotten. And you're not known. And the contrast that Dreyer makes is, look at Dante. He started down that road, but as a result of his crisis, kind of switches directions, makes something with an end towards serving God and serving others, and it becomes this timeless classic that people like me and you are still talking about thousands of years later. there's an accountability aspect too. You've been given talents, you will use them in a certain way, and you will be held accountable for how you use them. Chapter 14. A little more comfortable. Let's talk about institutional church and and teeing off on priests. Getting deeper into the Inferno, Dante, led by Virgil, comes upon a pope. Wow, that's interesting. A Catholic seeing a pope in hell. What is going on there? Well, we find out that this pope is corrupt. This pope abuses his position. And Dante lets him have it. Absolutely goes off on him. He says, you have perverted good and evil. You have raised up evil. You have trampled down good. Which is bad in and of itself, but it's especially bad because you are a leader of the church. And as a result, your sin is profound, and you are damned, and you are bound for hell. Now, if you come from a Protestant background, or if you come from a non-Christian background, you might be going, okay, yeah, so. But for someone who comes from a Catholic perspective, this is quite significant. You don't hear, certainly not in public, like in public discourse, public writing, Catholics going off on leaders of the church, to say nothing of the Pope, to this degree, especially not during that time. Now, maybe today is different. Maybe, if it's Francis or it's Benedict, Benedict XVI or whoever it was, Catholics are more likely to criticize. Francis, in particular, has a unique gift of making just about everyone angry for different reasons. But again, you think about the context of Dante in the 14th century, this is staggering. So he talks about the institutional church leader and the destructive aspect of what this person has done. When an individual raises up evil and tramples good, that's one thing. But when a representative of God does it, then the people in the church have no way to be able to even deal with that. You have corrupted that which is most basic, and you have done it in the name of God. Therefore, your sin is entirely more profound as a result. And again, Dreyer, working through his own story, connects this to the Catholic abuse scandal that exploded just in the past decade or so. I don't know, some of you might be my age, or close to my age. You might remember this. Some of you might not even remember it. But 2003, 2004 is when it absolutely exploded. I was actually living in Boston at the time, and Boston was ground zero for a lot of this. It just exploded. And I can tell you from personal experience how many conversations I had with Catholics who weren't really happy Catholics anyway, but when all this stuff blew up, they said, nope, I'm done. I'm out. I didn't go back. And Dreyer is one of those people. He says, and his is a little bit different because he's a reporter, so he's getting into the details and actually interviewing people who were affected. But he says the process of reporting on this scandal separated him from his faith. He said, I just can't. I can't trust these people. Not only are they sinning, but they're covering it up. They're assassinating the character of people who would expose them. They are protecting people who need to be prosecuted. They've taken good and they've called it evil, and they've taken evil and they've called it good. They've completely turned everything on its head. He just says, I can't. I'm out. Which is really interesting. And he goes into this meditation about the institutional church. And your reflection this week is actually based on this idea. And he goes on into this reflection of the added responsibility. If you claim to be a leader of the church, of God's institution, you have a lot more burden, a lot more responsibility that's placed on you. Because you have a responsibility to tell of the world in the way it actually is. And these people, when they reverse it, when they pervert it in the name of God. And they completely betray any type of trust that would otherwise be built. It's led to, and not just the abuse scandal, but I think goes a long way towards explaining, in a lot of ways, the state of the church in America in 2016. Like, I could get into this a little bit, but the bottom line is church attendance is, in the most positive scenarios, the denominations, church attendance is flatlining. In the most negative scenarios, it's cratering, it's free falling. I mean, just an interesting example, the American Catholic Church, the numbers of people that are members of Catholic churches in America would have gone off a cliff if it weren't for immigration, funny enough. The white Catholic population is absolutely cratered, but it's been replaced and kind of bolstered even by the Latino population of Catholics in this country. Other mainline denominations, Episcopalianism's fallen off a cliff, Methodism's fallen off a cliff. The evangelical denominations, like the Southern Baptist Convention, have been slower in their decline, but they're showing signs of decline as well. There's a lot of different reasons for this, and I don't want to simplify it, but one of the things that I think that can be pointed to is the fact that people are just a lot less willing to trust these institutional figures of authority, in particular, church members, heads of churches. There's a betrayal of trust. And what Dante wants to say, and what Dreyer wants to say, is that puts these sins in a deeper realm of hell than they otherwise would have been, because there's a responsibility not just as individuals, there's responsibility as representatives of the church and representatives of the God who founds the church. This gets into interesting conversations about what the church actually is, and how you can reconcile the idea of church being instituted by God on the one hand, but full of sinful individuals on the other. Certainly not a new problem. St. Augustine has a quote that's attributed to him. I don't know if he actually said it, but it's attributed to him. It says, "The church is a whore, but she is my mother." Other people have said, no, it was Dorothy Day that said that. But think about the contrast. The church is a whore, but she's also my mother. So there's a sense of unfaithful, untrustworthy, everything, but still mother, a development, my home, if you will. How do you reconcile the fact that you have this institution of God that's peopled and is operated by sinful individuals? Not a new problem, but Dreyer addresses it here. And then finally, just to kind of wrap up, because I'm going on and on here, chapters 15 and 16. Chapter 15, he talks about Ulysses, the pride and the vanity of Ulysses, kind of similar to what we've already seen. Ulysses is using his talents, but what for? Something good, the betterment of knowledge for mankind. But in the process, runs roughshod over his crew, runs roughshod over any sense of boundaries, any sense of maybe you want to stop. Sometimes you just have to stop looking. And then chapter 16, kind of wrapping up this section on the Inferno, Dreyer says, "The journey through hell is about examining your own faults. You have loved wrongly, you've loved disorderly, is that a word? And as a result, you screwed everything up, including yourself. You can't fix yourself on your own. You can't fix what you screwed up on your own. You need God to do it." And that's kind of how he ends in chapter 16. That's how he ends this section on the Inferno. And you're going, woof, that's not a very cheerful message, is it? No. But it is a message that's consonant with a lot of Christian history. One of the fundamental tenets, if not the fundamental tenet of Christianity, is there's a God and you're not it. You need a higher power. And the next sections of Dreyer, he's going to describe a little bit more about what that looks like. So next time you're reading, if not all of the Purgatory, you're reading most of it, or Dreyer's conception of it. And that'll be what the road to redemption looks like, how the fixing comes about. It's not, spoiler alert, it's not through the will of the individual, it's through the sense of divine help. And we'll show what that looks like. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, that covers it for this week.